So ostensibly, well, not ostensibly, Hartman entitled this unit, I think it's something about compromise. And I'm not sure, I mean, I've said this all along, it's very interesting when you just teach other people's curriculum, would I have chosen those texts, or do I see these texts as really under the category of compromise? And so I would say, I don't know that I would have called this compromise. Though I suppose one could argue when we look at the text, there is something to that. I think that these are the texts that they have chosen today are
Rabbi,
among
we were told
the most
that
primary Jewish texts. To quote Rabbi Frankel, very famous to a small group of people, very foundational. One of the texts that we're looking at today, I think is actually would have been, and maybe they'll use it in the unit on faith. I think it says much more about faith and God and how we look at God and our relationship with God than it actually talks about ethics. But you know, in a certain way, sometimes these things obviously have their overlaps. If there's any sort of sense of compromise in these texts, I think it flows from what we were speaking about last week, which is, and I don't know that if I would have used the word compromise. I think I would prefer to use the word balance between justice and mercy. How do you balance these values? Oh, managing tensions. Okay, thank you, Norm. The title is Managing Tensions. So again, I'm not sure that I love that title either, Managing Tensions. I think that there was probably a more spiritual way to phrase it. But in any case, the tension that they're trying to manage, or that Judaism is trying to manage, is the balance between justice and mercy, or we may even say justice and peace. How do you have it? You know, one, unless you unpack it, one might not necessarily think about those things as competing values. One would say, well, you have to have a world with justice and you have to have a world with mercy, that those are two very important values. But there are times that we looked at last week where those two things bump into each other. And then moral and ethical,
this is my casual class, sorry,
need to be made about, you know, I'll give you an example just from the last few days, which I don't think is a just decision, though maybe it was a merciful decision, though maybe it wasn't a merciful decision. We don't have to debate it. But Dan and I we love watching the Olympics. We're not boycotting the Olympics. We love the Olympics. We're very into it. We are a little stunned, if you've been following this whole thing about the Russian figure skater, that because she's only 15, they are showing her mercy in not, you know, ruining her career, and they're letting her skate. So, you know, we don't have to get into a whole big discussion about this, but I feel like in being merciful to her, you are not being just to all of the other skaters that skate clean. And while it's true that she's 15, and if they really had given her the full punishment, which I think is a 4-year suspension, they basically will have ended her career. And I think she's a victim. I mean, she's a 15-year-old girl who I'm sure her coaches said, take this in a fascist society. And if she wanted to skate for the Russians, she took it. And that they're guilty of child abuse. Nonetheless, the question of, you know, if you're merciful in one case, you're unjust, or maybe even not merciful in another case. And there are many situations like that, that if you are in a court system, you have to, you have to pick out. And so the first text that we're going to look at is probably the most fundamental text of all from the Torah, about Abraham arguing with God and Sodom and Gomorrah, and the question of punishing the righteous, right? When do the righteous get punished for the sins of the wicked? In society, righteous people get punished all the time for the sins of the wicked. But in the world that God is creating, is that really where does God, and that's why I think to a certain extent, you could have made the argument that this is actually, that many of these texts are actually more about faith than they are about ethics, because they have to do with the idea of where it's not just human justice, it's Judaism calling on divine justice.
Next time, put it at the right time, the right
I'm going to ask everybody if they could just mute, please, if you're not muted. Judaism or rabbinic Judaism, but I think even in the Torah, Judaism is a very chutzpahdik religion in its relationship to God that I think is very different than Christianity. Christianity is based on faith. And if you no longer believe, you're not a Christian. I shared this story. I can't remember if I shared it here or I shared it on a Shabbat morning, that I went to one of the many women that is one of my estheticians that I go to at this point in my life, or all the various things that one would go to. And she said to me, I want to talk to you. I'm a rabbi. I'm not Christian anymore. And I'm like, well, what does that mean to you? So she doesn't believe what her church has taught her all these years. And so she's no longer Christian. Though I think she does still have her own personal relationship with Jesus. You really don't hear Jews. You may have hear somebody say, I was born Jewish, but you don't really hear many people say, I'm not Jewish anymore. Because you can be Jewish in this day and age and not believe in God or not practice the ritual. It's so much more in Judaism. You can check out, but you can never leave. Even if you leave, we still consider you Jewish. It's Madeleine Albright. She's Jewish, even though she didn't know she was Jewish, even though she wasn't raised Jewish, even though she doesn't think of herself as Jewish. We're like, well, she is real. So Judaism is a much more, because we're more of a civilization or a people than just a religious faith. And so that allows, I think, for a great deal within the tradition of us challenging God. And our very name, Yisrael, is actually based on the story that when Jacob wrestles with the angel, he is renamed Yisrael, one who struggles with God and man and prevails. So inherent in the very name Yisrael is one who struggles with God, which is very different. I think Islam, I'm not sure if this is true, but I think it means like faithful, right? Like there are other religions where it's like you're described as, Christian, right? You're one who is in relationship with Christ. Islam, I think, is maybe it's to submit. It's to submit and to be faithful. And their name is We Wrestle. So this is a text about wrestling. And so, as I said, it may have some bearing on ethics, but I think this equally could have found itself in one of the units that Hartman did on faith. And maybe it does, because I haven't carefully looked at all of the various texts for that. So the Lord said, the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is exceedingly grievous. I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which comes to me, and if not, I will know. So the story of Abraham, right? He's living near these towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, and these towns are just filled with evil people. Now, remember, earlier in the Torah, we have the Noah story. And when the whole world is filled with evil of everybody except for Noah and his family, God comes in, creates a flood, wipes out everybody, and starts all over again with Noah. But at the end of that story, God says that now he knows that human beings are evil from their birth, and so he's never going to wipe them out again. And so that begins then, of course, the story of Abraham and the Jewish people and the receiving of Torah, and a different way of trying to turn people from being evil into being good. So God hears this is going on, and now he's going to check it out. The men turn from there towards Sodom. These are the angels that are visiting Abraham to tell him that that Sarah's going to give birth to a son in their old age. So they leave to go like do their job, but Abraham refuses to leave. And he says, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? So this is, you know, this is an incredible story, right? This is an incredible story. First of all, let's start out that Abraham is questioning God, and Abraham is questioning God based on a sense of righteousness or morality, that innocent God should not cause the innocent or the righteous to be swept away with the wicked. Perhaps there are 50 righteous in the city. Will you indeed sweep away and not forgive the place for 50 righteous that are there? So he's starting his great bargaining, right? He starts with 50, which of course turns out to be probably too high a number. May that be far from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. That may that be far from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? So Abraham is basically saying to God, you created this system of justice. And I would actually say built in here is also mercy, right? He calls God the God of justice, but it's also the idea that you wouldn't punish righteous people for the sins of the wicked, also calls on God's mercy. And I feel like Abraham tries to beat God at God's own game, right? Like, you set the rules, God. I didn't set the rules. If the rules were up to me, maybe I wouldn't question. You set the rules of justice, and the rules of justice should be that these innocent people should not be swept away with the wicked. So, of course, we know that Abraham bargains down 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. There aren't even 10 people in the city that are righteous. Lot and his family get to escape. They're part of that, maybe the only, and even they were not, so particularly righteous, just they had good connections. And then, of course, God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. But God tells Abraham, if Abraham can find 50 righteous people, if God finds 50 righteous people in the city, God will not destroy the city. So maybe there'll be another punishment, right? Maybe something else will happen to the evil people of Sodom and Gomorrah. But God hears what Abraham says and decides that this can't stand, that this isn't justice to make innocent people suffer. So fascinating, foundational text. I'm always very excited when, the Bar Bat Mitzvah student gets this text, because there's a lot to say about it. It's an incredible parsha. But it's a foundational parsha in that in the quest for both justice and mercy, there has to be a balance, not just a human balance, but God's self has to be bound to this. Now, it's a bit of a fairy tale, right? It's a bit of, we only wish, right? We only wish that God, I'm sure we'll see in a moment that even the rabbis realize that as much as we call God to justice, that's not really the world that we live in. One of my favorite Hasidic teachings is called the Tailor's Prayer. And it's 19th century, and it's right before Yom Kippur. And the tailor says to God, listen, I know it's Yom Kippur and I've committed some sins. Maybe I kept some material that belonged, to the person that was hiring me, and I didn't give it all back, or maybe I overcharged, and, and I know I need to atone for these sins, but you left children orphans and women widows. So I'll tell you what, I'll forgive you if you forgive me. Right? I mean, that's a really chutzpahdik prayer, but I feel like it's so Jewish in that this idea, we call God to account. Now, again, would that we lived in a world where we saw God stepping up and saying, okay, you're right, I won't do this. That's not the reality of the world as it is, but it's very fascinating. And, I mentioned this also on Shabbat. So my daughter has some really good friends that are very religious Christians, young women who are very religious Christians. And some of them were at a Shabbat dinner with some of my daughter and her Jewish friends 2 Friday nights ago. And one of the girls said, can we ask you guys a personal question? So Charlotte's like, yeah, sure. What? Like, could you tell us about your relationship with God? Like, what is your relationship with God? Charlotte said, the question itself is Christian. So anyways, they began to have, this much bigger conversation about faith and belief. And I think the Christian kids, the Jewish kids came away feeling like that these Christian kids had a very simplistic, not well thought out theology. And the Christian kids couldn't believe these Jewish kids they went to synagogue that Friday night, they had Shabbat dinner, that these Jewish kids don't even think about their relationship with God. And that, it was an interesting conversation in that, that they both, I think, had some interesting things to think about and some interesting judgment about the theology of the other side. But as I said, we come from a much more chutzpahdik tradition. So let's look at the next source. So Rabbi Levi says, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? So, right, this is a midrash on this parsha, on these verses. And Rabbi Levi, this is a Genesis Rabbah, is about 2,000 years old. It's an entire midrashic commentary on the entire book of Genesis. And Rabbi Levi said, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? If you want a world, there can be no strict justice. And if you want strict justice, there can be no world. You are grasping at the rope from both ends. You want a world in strict justice. If you do not give up a little, the world will not be able to endure. So I guess this is part of the managing tensions, or the idea of compromise. That in a world that called for strict justice, God might need to bring another flood. They're in a world of strict justice. How many people are really innocent? How many people are real? What percentage of the world is free of all sin? And so if you really held people accountable for every single thing that they did, this midrash says the world couldn't exist. You couldn't find, the world couldn't exist. But at the same time, if you did a world that was only merciful, what Rabbi Frankel used to like to say, and I don't know who he was quoting, you have to be careful that in being kind to the cruel, you end up being cruel to the kind. And I don't know who he was quoting, but he liked to quote that. In a way, this figure skater, which is not the world's best example, but it being merciful to her, you're being cruel to other people, right? And so you can't have a world that's based on strict justice, because none of us could live up to those standards. But nor could you have a world that was all merciful, because by being merciful to everyone, like a murderer, right, you let them off. Well, what about the family of the victims? So there has to be a balance between these two things, or the world can't exist. So I'm just going to stop there before we look at the next text to see if anybody wants to say anything or ask anything. Vera?
Mentioned that this young girl was given the ability to skate, but she's not going to have medals. So it's kind of, a little bit
Wait,
different
that's for
from
the
just
team
completely forgiving
competition.
her. Huh?
That's the team competition. Is that true if she wins? the women's?
That's not true.
No.
The caveat is they're not awarding them now until
Right.
they have further investigation
Okay.
and more
Right.
information. But they are going to rank them, and it is possible that she could get a medal at a later date if they still absolve her.
They just said they're not gonna have a ceremony.
Yeah,
There won't be a medal
Right.
ceremony. So if she gets a medal, if she qualifies for a medal, the other two people who qualified for medals will be denied the opportunity to get their medals at a ceremony. So.
Well, the
there's
ceremony could be.
Okay,
the ceremony
I mean,
could
I
be
know
that.
this is, I mean, listen, I brought it up. I brought it up, but okay, so it's, I mean, in a way, it shows you. So yeah, so nobody will get their medals, and then these two other women will never stand at the podium at the Olympics and get their medal, no matter what happens.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's exactly what you're talking about. It's being cruel to the others, being merciful to her, and they didn't do anything wrong. So that's a perfect example. And it's not that they're not going to have the medals. That's today, but it's under consideration into the future. But they would have missed the other two winners. Would have met the other two medalists. Would have
And look, if one of
missed
them
the-
ends up getting the gold because she's knocked
Right.
out, she'll
Uh-huh.
never have had the opportunity to stand on the podium with her national anthem. All right, Marcia.
well, the thing is that I don't think it's about cruelty and kindness. I think it's about power. In other words, Russia, keep doping. We're not going to stand up to you. But it is the perfect example of the balance. Meanwhile, if she skates, they're not saying she can't get a medal.
Right.
I mean, they have revised medal orders before
Right.
with doping stuff, but mercy and justice, history is written by the winners, and justice is interpreted by the people with the power to do so. Or do you think it stands apart? I don't know. What do you think? Is justice interpreted by the people who have the power to do so? Or do you think
Well,
that justice is a freestanding
well,
thing?
there's probably no such thing as pure justice. Though we'd like to think that there is. And certainly in Rabbinic Judaism, when they think about how they set up the courts, or when the Torah talks about, one of the verses from the Torah is don't favor the rich nor the poor, which is interesting because everybody could, logically see why you would favor the rich, because they have influence, they have power, they have money. But are there times when you might favor the poor, because you feel sorry for them, because that this plays into a lot of things about white privilege today, right? Like, so should you favor people that have been at a disadvantage? But by favoring people that have been at a disadvantage, do you really bring justice? Like, these are issues that are still live issues, in today. Howard.
If Abraham were Christian or Christiany or Tikkun Olami, he could have raised why don't I get a chance to go in there and bring them the word of God and turn them around issue, as opposed to having just a two-dimensional destroy or not destroy ethic.
Okay, I'm not sure, how that would have really worked in those days, but yes, there might have been another option. Ina?
It seems to me in today's life that morality and ethics are in a situation where they're consistently being questioned. Talking about letting somebody off and white privilege, didn't this policeman Van Dyke in this past week or last week get off after he shot somebody that was just walking down the street 17 times? And he didn't get off, he served a few years. Then to bring up another trial that just finished, the Daley Thompson guy, who was accused of tax evasion, et cetera, et cetera. Was he used as, I mean, was he guilty? Was he given mercy? Is he being used as an example, as versing our past president who committed trillions of injustices? What is he getting? To me, morality and ethics in today's world are so questionable. I don't know, it's confusing.
But I do want to say something about Rabbinic Judaism, who insists that we can create a world like this, lived during horrible times. They were occupied by the Romans.
You've got mail.
They lived under a cruel, we're going to see a text, a really important text that kind of discusses this, that it's not like the rabbis lived under great times. They lived under horrible times and still insisted that there was a way to build a world that would bring justice and mercy into the world. And that's part of, I think,
Is that part of their spirituality?
it was part of their spirituality. It was part of their beliefs that this was the world that God wanted us to help create. Listen, I can say, I think this, for those of us that are Democrats that suffered during the Trump administration, and I know I have some friends that are Republicans who insist that they're suffering under the Biden administration, and I'm like, listen, you may not like his policies, but you just can't. I'm not comparing the suffering of the two. I'm not going down that road with you. But for those of us that feel like our whole lives we've wanted to work for a better world, to question, like, why do things seem to keep getting worse? Like the funerals that I did in the early days after Trump was nominated, people would say to me about their elderly parents that passed away, like they were so sad that this was like the last thing they were going to see in the United States. And I heard that over and over. Hal.
Well, if you balance mercy and justice and then stop the discussion, then there's no guidance on how you're supposed to do that. So I wonder whether in the later text or the rabbis had some guidance to give. For example, with our ice skater here, I suspect, obviously don't know, that people were saying, well, wait a minute, it's cruel not to have the winners be on the stand and get that pleasure. But on the other hand, it's be more cruel to do this to a 15-year-old girl, and that's how you're supposed to balance it. But I just wonder whether the rabbis, after realizing that you needed this balance, came up with some ideas on how you make those
20
balance.
volumes of Talmud.
That's what I thought.
20 volumes of Talmud that much of which deals with civil law, not all of it, but much of which deals with civil law. Your ox gets out and gores my ox. What's the penalty? What if they're a prior offender and they got out a second time or a third time? What's your responsibility when you know you have a dangerous animal and you let it get out? Unbelievable minute details about how you create a just society, how you set up a court system, how you rule in certain cases. There's basically 2,000. Now, once Jews lost the right, I mean, even in Europe, there were Jewish courts that were basically dealing with civil matters because you didn't go to the non-Jewish courts because you didn't trust them. One of the interesting fun facts, Norma, I'll call you 1 second. One of the interesting fun facts, when we historically asked, how was it that, Jews were so successful in commerce and became sort of the middle class when so much was closed to them in Europe and in Africa? And one of the answers was they could do cross-border trade with other Jewish communities. So you could have a merchant that set out, from Italy and went to Greece or Morocco, and they could all do business together. Well, what allowed them to do business together was rabbinic courts. You had redress instead of like, if you were, a non-Jewish person that went to Morocco to do business, you could be taken advantage of, you could be stolen from, and there would be no idea that you as a a Polish person would get justice in a Moroccan court. But because the Jewish community had rabbinic courts, it allowed them to set up redress if something went wrong, and therefore that's one of the reasons that that Jews were able to flourish in that way. Norm?
Justice is complicated. It's hard to take one isolated case and talk about whether that's just in a whole situation. When we talk about this skater, several months ago, the Olympic Committee said that the Russians were doing institutional doping and they were not going to be allowed to send a team. So that's why it's the Russian Olympic Committee, because it's not the Russian team that's being sent. But they said that the Russians couldn't send a team, but any individual athletes who didn't test positive could compete. As it turns out, as far as I'm concerned, there's still a team and whatever. So theoretically, all the athletes that are there didn't, so they did make a decision that said, we're not going to penalize the athletes who didn't dope because of what their team did. And as a result, they got into this situation because now they have someone who tested positive anyway. And, so they sort of caused the situation themselves, but it's not as if there wasn't any mercy for other people. They tried to do it at a certain point, but it gets complicated.
Well, maybe too much mercy is, again, people sometimes don't learn their lesson. Anyways, by the way, I want to say I'm in my office, which is not a place where I usually am so much in the last 2 years. So it's nice to be coming to you from the synagogue. Okay, let's look at another text, which is, again, circles back to the idea of really faith. And how do we deal, like we said, okay, Sodom and Gomorrah is fantastic, right? Abraham confronts God, God responds, God changes God's mind and is willing to compromise with Abraham. And everybody, well, not the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, but, the Jewish people live happily ever after, knowing that we had this great figure that stood up to God and that God responds to, righteous human beings. As if, how great it would be if the world actually worked that way. So here we deal with the text that is, deals with such deep spiritual angst. And we sometimes like to think that we are, as moderns, the first generation to really struggle with our faith and to struggle with, what does it mean to believe in God in a world, fill in the blank. I do believe, and I said this to my daughter when we were talking about, her Christian friends. It's not that as a Christian, bad things don't happen to you, right? Human beings suffer. You lose people that you love. You have tragic accidents. It's not that as human beings, they don't struggle and suffer. But I'd like to say that Christianity is a triumphant religion. Yes, they had some early struggles in the beginning with Rome feeding them to the lions. But basically, Christianity is a triumphant religion. They succeeded. They took over and had followers around half the world. And they, other than in very rare cases, they weren't persecuted for being Christian. And so it's not surprising that they have a theology that's much more optimistic. It's much more optimistic as far as, God will save me. I have a personal relationship. Yes, Jesus suffered, but he suffered for us. So we're very grateful. Jewish history is dark. Jewish history is so dark. When the millennium turned over, I thought it would be a good time, since everybody was talking about it, that it would be a good time to teach about the last 1,000 years of Jewish history. It was horrible. It was so horrible. it was just one horrible tragedy, suffering, crusades, pogroms, basically topped off with the Holocaust. And yes, you got the founding of the state of Israel, but it was just horrible. And so when you have a people that has suffered as much as our people suffer, it affects your theology. And it affects, how you question, what you think about, and your relationship with God. And so I'm going to bring this source now that I think that you might be surprised is a 2,000-year-old source in dealing with evil and suffering in the world and God's role and how we try to make sense of it. So you might not like the ending of it, but I think you'll be moved by the beginning. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud. So again, it's about 1,800 years old, 1,700 years old. Rabbi Joshua, the son of Levi, said, okay, let's back up for a minute. So he's going to talk about the men of the Great Assembly, which we call the Sanhedrin. So they were basically the Jewish government, but under Rome. So they ruled over the Jewish people. They ruled on religious law. They were like the beginning, when we talk about the beginning of the rabbinic period, they were the Jewish government. But of course, they were under the auspices of the Roman government and at the mercy of Rome. So why were they called great? So you'd say, oh, the men of the Great Assembly. I would say great means like the big assembly. But they're like, no. Because it's called Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, right? So in Hebrew, it could be translated as big. Gadol is big. They're the men of the big assembly. There were 70 of them. But they want to read Gadol as in moral, like as in great. There was they weren't just a large body, they were a great body. So what made them great? Because they restored the crown to its greatness. Meaning they brought a crown to God's name, meaning really they restored faith in God in their generation. Like what? The generation of Jews of the Talmudic period had a crisis in faith in God? The whole people? Well, that's what they're saying. Yep, the whole people. The whole people living under these horrible times had a crisis of faith. And the men of the Great Assembly were able to restore belief in God's greatness to their generation. And so how did they do this? So in the Torah, and it actually becomes part of our liturgy, is the phrase, Adonai, Adonai, al rachum v'chanum, erech apayim u'melei chesed v'rachamim. So it says, so Moses says this to God when God passes in front of Moses, at one of the stories in the Torah. Moses calls out God's greatness and proclaims him as great and powerful and awesome. And so, as I said, it becomes actually a prayer that we recite as part of our holiday liturgy. Jeremiah, who prophesied during the destruction of the first temple. So during the biblical time period, the first temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. The Babylonians take the Jewish population away in chains, lead them away from the land of Israel to resettle them basically as slaves, but not just as slaves, in Babylonia. In ancient times, there was warfare practice of population transfer. The ideal is that once you took the Jews or the Israelites or any other people away from their land and their religious sites and their language, and you resettled them, they would become good Babylonian citizens because they would no longer be Israelites. They would be subsumed into the Babylonian culture. And it would be over, right? It would be over, and there would be, which is why when you say, what happened to the Hittites and the Jebusites? Like, what happened to all these other ancient people that no longer exist? That's what happened to them. They were conquered and they were subsumed into whoever conquered them. We alone of the biblical period, because of historical circumstances, maybe because we're super stubborn, maybe because we weren't exiled long enough, here we still are. So Jeremiah, which was terrible, right? Jeremiah is led away in chains and he dies in prison in Babylonia. And he said, strangers are frolicking in God's sanctuary, right? Strangers, not just strangers, idol worshipers. Idol worshipers are in our holy temple. Where are the displays of God's awesomeness? And therefore he stopped saying awesome. You know, we talk about changing liturgy, which we do so carefully in the conservative movement. We almost never do it. Well, here the prophet Jeremiah is so devastated by what's happened that he can no longer say awesome. So when he repeats Moses's words in prayer, he calls God great and powerful, but no longer awesome, as a reaction to this theological crisis. Daniel, you know the story of Daniel and the lion's den. Right now, the children of Israel are in Babylonia and they're living in Babylonia, and Daniel becomes a court Jew, as has happened to many, you know, Jews throughout history, and he's punished by the Babylonian king and he's thrown into the lion's den. And said, strangers are enslaving God's children. Where is the displays of God's power? Like, look what they're doing to us. Like, not only did they destroy our temple, but now they're enslaving us. Where is God? Why isn't God freeing us? Why isn't God standing up for us? God, it must not be powerful enough to do this. So when he prayed, he called God great, but not powerful or awesome. So you see this unbelievably dramatic chipping away at faith. If this is what's happening to the Jewish people, or this is what's happening to the Israelites, I can't pray. I can't say these words. They're not true. They're not authentic, or they're a betrayal. Either God isn't powerful enough to help us, or God doesn't want to help us. And therefore, I'm not going to say these words that I don't believe in. It's unbelievable. Like, you'd think that the first Jewish person that ever said this was, you know, in 1952 or 1948 or whatever, the end of the Holocaust. So it's pretty amazing to me to see the rabbinic words of almost 2,000 years ago with the same theological challenges and to a certain initial response. And the rabbis are pretty sympathetic at this point. And so he didn't say powerful. The men of the great assembly followed and said, on the contrary, this is God's magnificent strength. For God restrains God's will, showing forbearance to the wicked. And these are the displays of God's awesomeness. Because if it were not for God's awe of the blessed Holy One, how could one solitary singular nation survive among the nations of the world? And how could the masters do this? Were they not uprooting a decree that Moses made? Rabbi Elazar said they knew that God is truthful and therefore would not lie about God. So two things. Why? Two really important things. The men of the great assembly said, no, God is awesome and powerful and great. God's awe and power and greatness is not that he rushes in to save people and to punish the wicked. God's awesomeness and greatness and power is that God doesn't come in and destroy the world, because God could come in and do what he did with the flood. And the fact that God allows the world to stand and make its own way, even with all of the evil, it's God's self-restraint. And then they asked the little question at the end, but okay, what about the people like Jeremiah and Daniel who didn't say these things? It's okay. It's okay to be truthful in your prayer. God doesn't want us to lie. So even that's okay. But what the men of the great assembly do is give the option of looking at God in a very different way. Now, as I said, this may not be theologically satisfying. You might prefer, sometimes I think so, a God that runs in and cleans up our mess. Like, I don't know, I think that might have been better than the Holocaust. but it's turning everything on its head. And it's part of what I love about Rabbinic Judaism. I love the chutzpahdik nature of it and the permission that it gives us to say, I mean, I'm not, you know, that I'm not really a great fan of editing the liturgy. We use a prayer book that has only very slight differences than, let's say, an Orthodox prayer book. I'm not big on changing the words, but I think this text frees us up, a 2,000-year-old text, to reinterpret the words and to say, yeah, maybe that's what it meant to our ancestors, but it doesn't mean that to me. And so I have to figure out another way to make it work in order to communicate with God through this venue of these words. Marcia.
But isn't that just semantics if you are going to change your interpretation, and anyone can change or alter or modify the interpretation? Then just you say we're, reluctant to change the words. But what do you define as the difference between changing the word to a less harsh word and actually just reinterpreting it in your own mind?
Okay. So that's why I'm a conservative Jew, right? And not a Reformed Jew. The Reformed Judaism does change the liturgy. And they said, we don't believe this anymore, so we're not going to say it. Reconstructing Judaism, they changed their name, changes the liturgy and says, if I don't believe it, I'm not going to say it. So to me, the words are sanctified, not because God wrote the prayer book. God didn't write the prayer book. Human beings wrote the prayer book. But to me, the words are sanctified by the fact that our people have been saying them for 2,000 years. And so I'm not so willing to give up the liturgy that our people said for 2,000 years because I have a different sensibility. So it sometimes is a struggle, right? It sometimes is a struggle. It sometimes is easy because I sing the words in Hebrew and I love the beautiful melody and I don't think too closely about what each word says. So for me, I would say it's not semantics and it works for me theologically. It doesn't work for everybody. And that's why there are different denominations of Judaism that deal with it, in a different way.
Okay.
Marcia.
When did it come back in? We say it, so.
Probably right away, because it's like the rabbis are saying Jeremiah and Daniel didn't do this, but Jeremiah and Daniel lived 500 years before the rabbis. So it's possible that nobody ever stopped saying it.
Okay.
And they're just telling this story to try. I mean, I think that's probably more likely is that Jeremiah and Daniel never stopped saying these things and they weren't recorded anywhere. And Jeremiah wasn't praying the liturgy. The liturgy was written under Rabbinic Judaism.
Okay.
So it's anachronistic. They're reading it back in and they're putting it in the words of these very respected people who've been dead for 600 years. So who are you going to argue with, whether they said it or not? The rabbis wrote the liturgy. They decided to take this text from Moses, and that Daniel and Jeremiah were not praying from the Siddur. So the rabbis want to it's the rabbis that want to make a statement. It's the rabbis that want to say, we understand that people are having a crisis of faith. This is a terrible time to be living. The question of how the heck Rome, this evil empire, defeated us, this good, the rabbi saw, when the Babylonians defeated the Israelites, the theology was, we sinned and this is our punishment. By the time the Romans defeated the Israelites, there was some of that. There was some things that we were guilty of. The biggest thing we were guilty of was not idol worship was sort of gone. So that big sin was off the table. What we were guilty of is how we treated each other. But the rabbis saw Rome as so evil that they could not theologically say this was a punishment from God. But yeah, say that to somebody who's like suffering. And so they want to say, like, we understand you're having a crisis of faith. We understand you're asking the question, where is God? And we're telling you our answer is the only way the world can survive and not have another Noah in the flood is God can't step in. God won't step in. It's hard for God to restrain God's self. He loves you and he wants to step in. In a way, it becomes a very parental role of adult children. I told Dan, he's actually surprisingly never heard this before, but we are so thrilled to be grandparents, and we've been spending quite a bit of time with Shai and Sahar. And we and Dan too, we're like very quiet. Unless they ask us for advice, we don't pipe in. So I told Dan that I've had a lot of women over the years say to me, you see these grooves in my tongue? It's from biting my tongue around my in-law. So Dan had never heard that. I don't know, maybe men don't get that advice from other men. I got that advice from a lot of women. But anybody that's ever parented adult children or dealt with in-laws, you realize that to be in relationship, you have to show a certain amount of restraint, and they're grown-ups. And they're grown-ups, and they should do, in order to let our kids grow up, we have to pull back. And that's a very rabbinic image for God. It's a sign of caring that God pulls back. It's a sign of God entrusting us with the world. And yes, that means really bad things happen because there are really evil people in the world. But otherwise, we never grow up. So again, one might argue, well, yeah, but given how bad it is, maybe, maybe a little less growth could be a good thing. Sharon?
Oh, I wanted to go back to somebody else's comment about if you're just reinterpreting it all the time, what's the meaning? And I feel like you can equate the liturgy with the Constitution, which is an evolving document. You can also look at it in terms of like the Declaration of Human Rights, which is aspirational. I think of Judaism as a very aspirational religion. We aspire to be good. We aspire to do the right thing. But every year at Yom Kippur, we atone for our sins and we sort of get a clean slate and we're allowed to start over again. And in a religion where it's aspirational and meanings can change to adjust to the times, justice and mercy is integral to that, because you're always striving and you can recognize the failure, but you have to show justice and mercy. It's like all part of the same thing.
One of the prayers I keep thinking about, the last line of Birkat Hamazon is Nahar Ayiti V'gam Zakanti V'lo Ra'iti Tzaddik Nezav. I've been a young man and I've been an old man and I've never seen a righteous person begging for bread. So there are people that won't sing that line because it's not true. But most people sing that line. And so when I sing that line, I think about, while it's not true that there aren't righteous people begging for bread in the world, I think about what's my responsibility towards people that don't have enough to eat. I think when it was put in the liturgy, it was put in as this statement of faith for God, that God wouldn't let such a terrible thing happen to a righteous person. But nobody would say that because nobody would think that today because we know it's not true. So what do you do if it's not true? Do you just take it out and not say it? Or do you say it's a holding place? It's a reminder. I just finished a meal. I'm so happy that I had enough to eat. And in spite of this verse saying something that's not true, I end the whole thing of being thankful that I had enough to eat by wondering, what is my responsibility in the world to make sure that that's not true? Okay, who else? Anybody else? So it's interesting. I don't know if you agree with me. I feel like these texts were much more, could have and maybe they could have been in the faith unit. But as Norm pointed out, this is about managing tensions, and there is a tension in how we look at justice and mercy, both and how humans carry it out, but also how we see God's role in all of this. There's this beautiful prayer from the Talmud that I love. when we read on the high holidays, the story of Hannah, who is childless. I mean, that's a theme that runs through the Torah, but also runs through the high holiday liturgy. And her co-wife, because of course men could have more than one wife, her co-wife is having children and she can't have children. And this is a terrible thing. And the Talmud writes a prayer in her words. She didn't really write it, but they write it using her words. And she says that her prayer, she says to God, you created me with a womb to give birth. You created me with breasts to suckle. Why are you withholding a child from me? And what I love about that is I feel it reflects Abraham saying, should not the judge of all the earth deal justly? You create, like, I didn't create these longings. I didn't create my physicality that, was built to do this. You did. So you owe me something. You owe the world justice. You owe the world mercy. You owe me what you built me. I mean, in Hannah's word, not every woman feels this way, right? But you owe me for what you built me to do. And then I want to do it. You owe me. And it's chutzpahdik, but that's what I like about it. That's what I like about it, even though all of our wishes and prayers are not fulfilled and terrible things happen and suffering happen. I do love that our tradition says, okay, God, I'm not letting you off the hook so easily for this. I'm not letting you off the hook. I may have to learn how to accept it, but I'm not letting you off the hook for this. And that actually helps me with my faith. I either because I was born this way or because God, you created me this way, but it helps me be able to be a person that has some faith in a world that does everything it possibly can to chip away at it. All right, it was lovely seeing all of you. I will see you again next week, if not sooner. Just a reminder, we have one more Shabbat morning online, and then we are taking the plunge. We will continue to live stream, but we're taking the plunge to try to be in person. So if you are so inclined and you feel safe, I'm a little worried about getting a minyan. We still have a lot of people out of town. So if you want to do a mitzvah, we'd love to see you. Bye.